Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Today we've got a few things to discuss, including a couple of entry-level contract signings with a few different teams, some more injury updates, and some more off-season rumors, this time involving the eliminated Philadelphia Flyers and St. Louis Blues. And we'll get to all of that coming up right now. Hello and welcome to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before I get started with all the news and rumors for today's video, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that I am trying a new setup today. As you can see, I've changed up a few things from my usual setup, so just trying this out for now, just seeing how this works. And I may also try and add a few things in the background over the next couple of weeks, so definitely keep an eye out to that. But just want to acknowledge the fact that I am trying some new setup today, so definitely want to just get that fact out there. But without further ado, let's get to the news and rumors of the video. To start with, we're going to start with a couple of entry-level contract signings, as there have been a flurry more of young players signing the entry-level contracts over the past week. I will start with the Calgary Flames, as they were able to sign one of their top unsigned prospects in forward Matthew Coronato to a 3-year entry-level contract that has the average annual value of $925,000, and that contract will begin with the remainder of this season. So for Coronato, he was a former first-round pick of the Calgary Flames back in the 2021 draft, 13th overall, so he was one of the higher-rated players who has not signed his entry-level contract yet from that draft. So it's good to see him get his entry-level contract. He hasn't played at all yet for the Calgary Flames, but he's been with the team over the past 2-3 games, and we're going to expect him to at least get 1 or 2 games down the stretch of game action before the season ends. But definitely, I think Coronato is going to be a great fit for the Calgary Flames. He's definitely a solid top 9 forward. We know the Flames have been looking for forward help all year this year. They went out at the deadline. They went out and acquired Nick Ritchie as a short-term option, but they were going to need a long-term option. So getting Coronato is a huge, huge win for the team. The right winger has had a really good couple of years over in college. Last year, putting up 18 goals and 36 points in 34 games. This year, 2 more goals, but the same point total in the same amount of games, with 20 goals and 36 points in 34 games. So Coronato definitely looks like a really, really good, talented player. Even if he doesn't get into very many games this year during the playoff run, I'll definitely expect him to make the NHL jump next year, maybe on like the 3rd line. So yeah, I don't think Coronato is going to take too much time to get into game action for the Calgary Flames, but definitely good to see him get his entry-level contract. I think of all the players who don't have their entry-level contracts right now playing in college, Coronato was one of the bigger names. So good to see the Calgary Flames get him signed. He should be able to get into some game action before the end of the season, maybe in the playoffs as well, but definitely I think Coronato is going to be a great addition for the Flames, if not right now, then at the start of next year for sure. As for the Montreal Canadiens, they signed one of their top prospects playing over in the NCAA, as they signed 2024th round left wing / center Sean Farrell to a 3-year entry-level contract that will have an average annual value of $898,000. Now, for Farrell, he can definitely play a different variety of positions. He can play left wing, he can also play center, so good to see Farrell finally get his NHL contract. He was a 4th rounder from a couple of years ago, but he definitely seems like he has a solid NHL future ahead of him. He had a pretty good season last year in the NCAA, putting up 10 goals and 28 points in 24 games, but absolutely blew it out of the water this year, putting up 20 goals and 53 points in 34 games, which is a really great season for him over in the NCAA. So it's good to see Farrell finally get his entry-level contract for the Montreal Canadiens. I think either next year, or if they feel that he could benefit from a year in the minors, then in 2 years' time, Farrell should definitely be a solid middle 6 forward for the Montreal Canadiens. He's even getting some NHL action at the end of this year, as he's already gotten into 3 Montreal Canadiens games and got his first career NHL goals. So good to see Farrell producing so far with the Montreal Canadiens, and good to see him get his entry-level contract. And I think in the next year or two, whether it be as a winger or a center, Farrell should definitely be a really good 3rd, 2nd line forward for the Montreal Canadiens. Over with the San Jose Sharks, they signed one of their newly acquired prospects in Henry Thrun, as they signed Thrun, who was a 2019 4th round pick, to a 2-year entry-level contract that will have an average annual value of $913,000, and the deal began right before the end of this season. So for Thrun, he was originally an Anaheim Ducks prospect taken in the 4th round of 2019. He was actually traded just before the trade deadline to the San Jose Sharks for a 3rd round pick, after Thrun made it clear that he wasn't really going to sign with the Anaheim Ducks, saw more of an opportunity with the Sharks, so he was able to sign there. Thrun looks like a really good 3rd, 2nd pair of defensemen for the Sharks in probably a couple of years. I mean, he looked really good in college, having 7 goals and 32 points in 35 games last year, and had 7 goals and 31 points in 33 games this year, so not too much of a difference. Thrun looks like an extremely talented left shot defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. I think in time he can definitely be a good top 4 defenseman. Probably looks going to start out as a third pair defenseman. He's already gone into 2 games of NHL action for the San Jose Sharks, putting up 2 assists, so really good production-wise so far for Thrun. I think maybe a year in the minors would definitely benefit him, so maybe he starts next year in the minors, but I think in a year or 2 time, Thrun should definitely be an extremely talented top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. And lastly here with the LA Kings, they signed newly acquired left shot defenseman Cole Kryger, who was a 2018 7th round pick, to a 2-year, $838,000 deal that will begin at the start of next season. Now for Kryger, he was acquired and traded with the Florida Panthers just after a deadline. Remember, trades can happen after a deadline. The players who get acquired just can't play for the rest of the season. So Kryger was never going to be able to make the LA Kings roster for the playoffs, so I don't think that was too much of a surprise. But he was acquired from the Florida Panthers for future considerations after it was pretty clear that he was going to sign with Florida. So Kryger goes to LA. He's had a pretty good season over in college as well, putting up 4 goals, 11 points in 35 games last year. A little bit better this year, putting up 10 goals and 16 points in 38 games. So definitely a really good acquisition for LA Kings. I think in a couple of years' time, maybe 2 to 3 years, Kryger should definitely be a good third pair defenseman for the LA Kings. Probably going to need a couple of years down in the minors, but I think in time, Kryger should definitely be a really good third pair defenseman for the Kings. So good signing for the Kings and the Sharks to sign newly acquired prospects that they acquired from different teams who didn't want to sign with them. But also good signings for the Montreal to sign Farrell and Calgary to sign Coronado. Hopefully in the not too distant future, all these guys can get into NHL action and show they're really good players. That's all the NHL contract signings I want to talk about for today. Next we go over to the injury update part of the video. We'll start with the Chicago Blackhawks, as they have had a little bit of good news off of their injury update, as they have gotten Jonathan Toews, Austin Wagner, and Alex Vlasic back from their injuries. Now for all 3 of these guys, they're out for definitely an extended period of time. Wagner's been out for 4 weeks due to undisclosed injury, suffering an injury just after Chicago acquired him from LA, so once again, not really great to see that, but Wagner's now back. He should definitely get a little bit of an opportunity before the season ends to show that he can definitely still play at the NHL level. Wagner's been playing in the minors the past couple of years after he played with the Kings a couple of years ago, so hopefully Wagner's recovered from his injury and can prove in the last 5 to 6 games he can still be a really productive forward. Next, with Alex Vlasic, he's been out since early December due to a foot injury. Was originally timelined to be out for a month and a half, but has since been out for just over 3 months. So not great news for Vlasic to be out for that long. Vlasic's probably one of the better defensive prospects for the Chicago Blackhawks, so it's not great to see him go down with the injury, but definitely seeing him recover from it is good. Once again, Vlasic's a really good third pair defenseman right now, and I think with him now being healthy again, he should definitely get at least a little bit of an opportunity before the season ends to show that he can definitely play third pair minutes for the Blackhawks. And then also, Captain Jonathan Toews has finally recovered from his illness and returned to game action. He was out for just over 2 months due to his illness, so once again, that illness caused him to not be traded at deadline. There was some talk that he might miss the rest of the regular season, so good to see him get back into game action for the Hawks. Definitely a lot of questions about his future up in the air right now, but to see him get at least one last chance with the Chicago Blackhawks before they probably move on from him in the offseason is really good, and hopefully Toews can make the best of these last 4, 5, 6 games with the Chicago Blackhawks. But definitely good to see all 3 of these guys in Toews, Wagner, and Vlasic get into game action. And hopefully all 3 of those guys can get back into game action and do really well. Wagner is a top 9 forward, and Vlasic that could show he can definitely be a good third pair defenseman for next year. And hopefully Toews can continue to do well in what will probably be his final games with the Chicago Blackhawks. Next, with the Detroit Red Wings, they have had good and bad news on the injury front, as Alex Chiasson and Ben Sherratt have both recovered from their injuries, but Robbie Farabee has now suffered one. So for Chiasson, he was only out for a couple of days, only missed a game due to his undisclosed injury and was right back into game action. So Chiasson signed a 1-year deal just before the trade line with the Detroit Red Wings, as the Red Wings started to become sellers. So far, been playing majority on the 4th line, but definitely done really, really well with the Red Wings, putting up some pretty good numbers. So good to see Chiasson get back. I know he's not a really big piece for the Detroit, but he's been a really productive bottom 6 forward. So good to see him get back in the lineup. Ben Sherratt's been out for a couple of weeks due to an upper body injury, so once again, not great to see him go down with the injury. Sherratt's definitely a really good top four defenseman. He's definitely going to be a really key piece of that top four now that Philip Hronik's gone. With the Red Wings most likely missing the playoffs right now, he's just going to get into a couple of games to finish out the season and then probably be a really big piece of that top four going forward into next year. So good to see Sherratt get back and hopefully can get into a couple more games of game action before the season ends. As for Farabee, he suffered a lower body injury and the team has ruled him out for the rest of the season. So once again, not great for Farabee. He's definitely a really good middle six forward for the Detroit Red Wings. Can definitely produce in a lot of different places, but given the fact the Red Wings probably only have a week and a half left in the season, if it was longer than that, he was probably going to be out for the season. So not great news for Farabee. Hopefully he can recover and be ready for training camp next year. I would expect him to. But good to see Chiasson and Sherratt get back, as Detroit still has some slim playoff hopes, but they're most likely going to miss the playoffs. So it's good to see Chiasson and Sherratt get back to hopefully help the Detroit Red Wings finish their season strong. Next, over with the Minnesota Wild, they've had a couple of injury updates, as Ryan Reeves and John Klingberg have returned to game action after suffering some injuries, but Mason Shaw suffered a really bad injury and is probably going to be out for the rest of the season. Now for Reeves, he was only out for 3 days due to an upper body injury, only missed a game. Klingberg was only out for a week due to his upper body injury and only missed a couple of games. So good to see both of these guys get back into the lineup. Reeves is a really good physical bottom six forward for the Wild who can really help that team, especially in the really tough playoff series. Klingberg is a really good offensive defenseman who they acquired at the deadline. Seems like he fits in really well in that third pair. So good to see both of these guys get back into game action. Klingberg's definitely going to be a really good bomb pair of defensemen to have in the playoffs and for the remainder of the regular season. Reeves is definitely going to be a really good bomb six forward, so good to see both of these guys get back and good to see that both of them were not out too long due to their injuries. As for Mason Shaw, he had a pretty bad injury over the past week, suffered a torn ACL, and he's going to be out for the rest of the season. So not great news. Probably going to be out for the next couple of months, which will probably mean that he's out for the rest of the season. I mean, there's a small chance that the Wild make it to like the Western Conference Final or the Stanley Cup. Maybe he comes back from this injury, but it's very likely now that Shaw's going to be down for a year. And that's really bad given the fact that he's actually proven that he can be a really good bomb six forward for the Wild this year. So good to see Reeves get back. Good to see Klingberg get back. Both are really good for the Minnesota Wild. Those two should definitely boost the Wild's roster for now, but definitely bad news to lose Shaw for possibly the rest of the season. And lastly, with the Montreal Canadiens, they've had a few injury updates, as Harvey Pinard, Savard, Belzile, and Monahan are all going to be out for a long period of time. Now for Pinard, he's probably the only one who's not going to be out for a long period of time. Currently has an undisclosed injury and is out day to day, so depending on how long it takes to recover from his injury, he could be back before the season ends. It's possible, but it's not guaranteed, so we'll have to see how his recovery time goes. Pinard's been a really good call-up by the Montreal Canadiens, and I think he could definitely earn a bomb six role for the Canadiens next year, so hopefully this injury isn't too long and he can get into like a game or two before the season ends. But all the other three are going to be out for the rest of the season. Monahan had a groin injury, he had to have surgery for it, and he's going to be out for the next 2 months. So that puts him out for the rest of the season. Not great news for Monahan. He's barely played ever since the calendar turned once again. Not great news. Monahan's once again been derailed due to injuries, so hopefully he can recover and be back with whatever team he signs with in the offseason for training camp. So hopefully Monahan can definitely get back before training camp is ready with whatever team he signs with in the offseason. As for the other two, Savard suffered a knee injury, Belzile suffered a leg injury, and they've both been announced to be out for the rest of the season. So not great news. Savard's a really good top four defenseman, a really good veteran on that team. So not great news to lose him for the last few games of the season. Belzile's also been a really good call-up, being fourth-line center. Not as productive as Pinard, but definitely really good bomb six forward. So not great news to lose both of these guys for the rest of the season. But given the fact that Canadiens are eliminated, they only have a couple of games left in the season, they're not going to the playoffs, it's not too surprising. So hopefully Pinard can get back in the near future, get back into game action, help the Canadiens finish out the season. But not great news to see Monahan, Savard, and Belzile be out for the rest of the season. Hopefully all three of those can recover from their injuries in the off-season and get back and are ready for training camp. Now that's all the injury updates I want to get to today, and we'll finally go over to the off-season report videos. There have been a couple more eliminations over the weekend, as the Philadelphia Flyers and St. Louis Blues have been added to the growing list of teams who have now been eliminated. as those two, as well as the Vancouver Canucks, have now made 9 teams eliminated from playoff contention for this year. So we're going to get to Canucks in a later video, but I want to focus our attention on the Philadelphia Flyers and St. Louis Blues offseason plans in this video. We'll start with the Philadelphia Flyers, as they were the first of the 2 eliminated. So the Flyers have not done overly great this year. They signed a new coach in the offseason in John Tortorella. There was a lot of talk that they would not be an extremely good team this year. I think this team actually did quite well given all the circumstances. They didn't do half bad given all of the rosters and stuff. They were a really injured team, which I think is one of the reasons why they didn't do too well. Ryan Ellis was out for the entire season due to his injury. Sean Couturier is most likely not going to play a game this entire season due to his injury. Cam Atkinson is probably not going to get any playing time this year due to his injury. So it hasn't been a great season for the Flyers injury-wise. And also they're lacking a little bit of talent on their forward group and the defensive group. So once again, not great. If you look at their stats, Philly's a bottom 5 team in the goal-scoring department. They're dead last in the power play. So offensively, they have definitely been a really bad team. Defensively is a little bit different. They're not overly bad on the defensive end. Currently 12th lowest in the goals against department and 8th lowest in the PK department. So once again, they haven't been overly bad on the defensive end. When he was coaching the Columbus Blue Jackets, John Tortorella usually had a really good defensive structure in place, and his team usually did really well defensively. So I think adding Tortorella definitely helped a little bit to improve that defensive end. But definitely, I think the improvement needs to be coming on the forward group. Now, for the Flyers, they've already announced after they fired their GM, Chuck Fletcher, and they brought in Daniel Briere for the interim GM, that they were most likely going to go down the road of a rebuild. So given that fact, there's probably going to be a lot of players who could be moved within the offseason. Now, if you look at the goaltending, they sort of seem like they have Sam Ersson, who has gone into a couple of games this year. They sort of view him as like a goalie of the future type goalie. So given that fact, also the fact that Hart's about to enter the final year of his contract, and would he really want to sign an extension with a team who's entering a rebuild? It's quite possible that Carter Hart could be a name to watch. Hart's a really good starting goaltender. There's probably going to be a couple of other goalies out there who the Flyers could fill in for the short term to be their starter, with having in mind the Ersson as the future starter. So I think for Philadelphia, they either try and extend Hart on a new long-term deal, or if Hart doesn't really want to do that, then I think it's possible that he gets traded. But I think they view Ersson as their starting goaltender of the future, maybe bring in someone who they can tandem with next year, and then maybe in a couple of years' time, Ersson's their starting goaltender. But I think that Hart situation is definitely going to be an interesting one to see, and I think Hart's definitely going to be a person on the trade block. As for the defense, they did pretty well this year, but I definitely think there could be a couple of changes. Now, Cam York is a restricted free agent this year. He's going to be a really big priority. York's a really good top 4 defenseman who's going to need a contract extension, so that's probably one of their top priorities as well to get him signed. I think he'll definitely be a consistent top 4 defenseman for the Flyers next year, so that's definitely going to be interesting. But I think as much as there have been speculation that these two could be traded, I don't see Sanheim or Ristolainen being traded. Ristolainen is going to be entering the second year of his 5-year deal. Sanheim is going to be entering the first year of his 8-year contract extension. I just don't see many teams having too much interest in either of these guys. So I think if they could keep them for now, they'll probably be like a top pair, as both these guys have played really well together. So in my opinion, I think Sanheim or Ristolainen probably stays. I'm looking at possibly a guy like Ivan Provorov or Tony DeAngelo being moved by the Flyers. DeAngelo is going to be entering the final year of his deal at a $5 million cap hit. He's a really good offensive defenseman. And I feel that if DeAngelo can go to a team where he can definitely be a good offensive defenseman in the top 4, I think DeAngelo could definitely do really good. So I think DeAngelo is going to be a one to watch, given the fact that the Flyers are a rebuilding team. They don't really need the last year of DeAngelo, so I could see him be a trade chip. There's definitely also been a lot of talk about Provorov. He's a really good top 4 defenseman who definitely seems like he needs a fresh start. So if the Flyers can find a new home for Provorov, I think they would definitely like that. So I definitely think that Provorov, DeAngelo, and the defensive end are going to be names to watch out for in the trade block. And I think they'll probably try and get some more youth in that team, like Zamula or Attard. And on the forward group, I think there's definitely a few players who could be moved. I think Kevin Hayes is probably the most likely one. Hayes is definitely going to be a really interesting name to watch out for, as he's having a really great season this year, but doesn't really seem to fit in that timeline for the Flyers, so I think he could be moved. And then Konecny and Farabee are both a couple of other interesting names to watch. Both are pretty good young players. Konecny's had a really great season this year. Farabee's had an up and down season, but both are really good players. Konecny has 2 years left on his contract. Farabee has 5, so both of those are going to be interesting to watch. Both are pretty good young players, but the Flyers may wind up moving them to try and get some more things for the future. So I think Konecny and Farabee are most likely going to remain Flyers, but it would not shock me if there was some interest in both of those too, and they would consider trading them. So I wonder about Konecny, Farabee. I think Hayes is definitely someone who's going to be traded. I think Atkinson was someone who they would probably want to trade, but given he has been in on injury reserve the entire season this year, there would be probably a pretty low market for him, given the fact he would be coming off an injury. So I would think maybe they start Atkinson next year, maybe try and find a trade for him either at the deadline or the following offseason. So definitely, I think there's going to be a lot of change for the Philadelphia Flyers. I think you could see a lot of players moved. I think names to watch out for are Hart, DeAngelo, Provorov, Hayes, maybe a guy like Atkinson, Farabee, Konecny. We know that Van Riemsdyk's most likely going to be gone after next year, as he's probably going to be leaving via unrestricted free agency. And we know that this team is most likely going to try and get some youth. So they think if they can get some more youth to this team, they should be a little bit more better. We know guys like Tippett, Cates, Allison, Frost are most likely the future of this team. So maybe they trade some guys. They bring in a couple guys via free agency. Maybe they use some cap space to bring in not favorable contracts to get some more draft picks. And I think Philly's definitely going to be an interesting team to watch over the next little while. So definitely, I think a lot of players are going to be on the block for Flyers, and I think they could be one of the more busier teams in the offseason as they continue to move and sell a lot of pieces as they kick off this rebuild. As for the St. Louis Blues, they're a little bit more of a different situation than the Flyers. I think Philly's going to be more of a fire sale this offseason, trying to sell off as many pieces as they can. I think St. Louis is going to be more of a retool. They're going to try and fix what they can in the offseason and try and be competitive in the next year or two. So, given their stats this year, they actually have not done really bad in the offensive category. Currently 15th in the NHL in goal scoring. So, once again, they've had Tarasenko, they had O'Reilly, they moved them at the deadline. There's been a couple of guys like Kapanen and Vrana who have come in, and they've still done really well offensively. So I don't think the offense is going to be the problem this year that they need to address. I mean, even on their power play, they're currently 12th lowest in the power play, which isn't overly bad. But that defense has been absolutely atrocious this year. They're 4th lowest in the goals against department, and they're 6th lowest in the PK department. So I think that defense is definitely going to need to do some retool. I think if you look at this team, they're still in a pretty good position. If you look at their forward group, they have an extremely talented top 9. I think there's probably not going to be very many players moved on their forward group. I think they pretty much have their good top 9 for next year. You have Thomas, Kyrou, Buchnevich as their 3 really great players who are most likely going to be top 6 players next year. You also have Vrana and Kapanen and Blais, who they acquired from Detroit, got off of waivers, and acquired from the New York Rangers, who have all done really well in middle 6 roles this year. And while they will all be entering the final year of their deals after this year, I do think that they'll probably keep all 3 of those guys, at least to start the season, and then maybe move on from them if they're not doing too well again next year at the trade line. So I think while they could move them on from them in the offseason, I think Kapanen, Vrana, and Blais remain with the team. They also have a couple of good veterans like Shen and Saad, who I think would definitely be really good middle 6 forwards. I do wonder if they maybe try and trade Saad, who will have 3 years left at $4.5 million cap hit. Not really sure if there will be any teams interested, but I think if there was anyone to be possibly traded on the forward group, Saad would probably be one of them. And then on top of that, they still have Jake Neighbors, who's not done overly well this year, bouncing around from the NHL to the AHL, but I think he should definitely be able to carve out at least a 3rd line role next year. So I think that's probably their top 9 next year. Maybe they try and move Saad, maybe they bring another top 9 forward. I think it's possible, but I think for majority part, that's going to be their top 9 for next year. They also have a couple of good up-and-coming centers like Zachary Bolduc and Zach Dean, who they acquired for the Ivan Barbashev deal, who both seem to be possible top 6 forwards in the next 2 to 3 years for the St. Louis Blues. And I think both could challenge for roster spots next year as well. So I think definitely the Blues are really set on the forward group. The defensive end, I think, could definitely use a shakeup, as well as the goaltending position possibly. If you look at their defensive end, Peronovich is definitely going to make an NHL jump next year. He has been out with injury the entirety of the season this year. He recently got back, was playing in the AHL, so I think he's definitely going to get an NHL spot next year. I think while he's entering the final year of his deal, Bortuzzo's a really good cheap option for the third pair. So maybe they keep like Peronovich and Bortuzzo pair next year. So I think that's possibly like a good third pair for the Blues next year. But I definitely think they could move at least one, if not a couple, defensemen. Marco Scandella is going to be entering the final year of his deal. I think he's a really good versatile player who can play up and down the lineup. So it would not surprise me at all if he was on the block, being that he's going to be entering the final year of his deal, and the Blues still have a really stacked D-Corp. So it would not surprise me at all if Scandella was traded. But I would also be watching out for one of the Blues' top 4 defensemen to be traded. Leddy has 3 years left on his deal at $4 million, probably the most likely to get dealt given his contract. But you also have Krug and Falk, who will have 4 years left at a $6.5 million cap hit. And you'll have Parayko, who will have 7 years left at a $6.5 million cap hit. So for all 4 of these guys, I think Parayko could probably bring the most value for the team. But I also think that there's also a possibility that Krug could be dealt, that Leddy could be dealt. I think Parayko and Krug were definitely mentioned around the trade line as being possible trade options. So I would definitely keep an eye on Parayko, Krug, Leddy. I think they'll probably try and keep Falk, but Parayko, Krug, Leddy, Scandella are all possible trade options. And it would not surprise me at all if they maybe moved a defenseman or 2 and they maybe try to get another one via free agency or use some of those draft capitals. They do have 2 extra first-round picks for this year's draft to maybe try and acquire a defenseman. It would not surprise me at all if they tried that either. So I think definitely a switch-up in defense is probably in the cards for the Blues. As for the goaltending position, it's definitely going to be interesting. Thomas Greiss' contract is probably going to be ending at the end of the season, and they're probably not going to bring him back. They've recently signed Joel Hofer, who seems to be the goalie of the future for St. Louis, so he's most likely going to get at least a backup role next year for St. Louis. So that's going to solve that, but I do really wonder about the future of Binnington in St. Louis. He's not done overly well this year. He's definitely just been more of a disruptor rather than a goaltender, definitely getting into a lot of rough stuff with some of the other teams, players. But I definitely wonder what Binnington's future holds in St. Louis. I think with Hofer possibly being the starting goaltender of the future, does Binnington really make sense to remain there? I mean, he could possibly be a good starting goaltender elsewhere if they feel that Hofer could definitely be a good starting goaltender in the next year or 2 for the Blues. So I definitely wonder if Binnington's future is possibly up in the air. I think it's possible they don't worry about it right now. Maybe run with like a Binnington-Hofer tandem next year. But I also think it's possible that with Binnington not playing overly well this year and maybe needing a fresh start, maybe they try and move Binnington to another team for some sort of a package. While the Blues do have a pretty good team, they also don't have too much in cap space. They only have about $5 million in cap space. So moving a couple of contracts is probably going to be a big piece of their offseason this year. And I do think possibly moving Binnington is an option. So I think definitely Parayko, Leddy, Krug, Scandella on the defensive end are all possible trade options. So I think they'll definitely try and shake up the defensive core. I think moving Saad, maybe it's possible to maybe bring in another top 9 forward, but I think it's more likely that Saad stays with the Blues. Also, I think it's possible they move Jordan Binnington. There's a lot of possible good starting goaltenders available for this offseason. So I definitely think moving Binnington is a possibility, especially with Hofer starting to come into his own as an NHL goalie. So definitely I think Binnington, Leddy, Parayko, Scandella, Krug, Saad are all possible trade options for the Blues, and they're definitely going to be interesting teams. I think they're definitely going to try to be aggressive in this retool and try and show that they're going to be a competitive team in the next year or 2. So that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Definitely like to hear your thoughts on what the St. Louis Blues and the Philadelphia Flyers could do in the offseason down in the comments. Does Philadelphia go for a fire sale? Does St. Louis possibly move Binnington? I think it's definitely a possibility that both those things happen, but I'd definitely like to know what you think. So definitely that's all I'm going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video and subscribe. I also do a blog, which I'll leave a link to that down in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.